last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as simple as 1, 2, 3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
what's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about tips and information that you can use to drink more mindfully. I'm your host, Derek Brown, an NASM certified wellness coach, award-winning bartender, and author of Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. I've said this on previous episodes. If you're just joining us, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm glad this is your first episode, but I want to share. I don't drink alcohol regularly. That's just the choice that I've made for myself. And I certainly don't think anyone else should make that choice unless that's where they want to go with it. And there are lots of options and alternatives. So that's the good news. But when I drank my last glass of recreational wine, it was a 1982 Lafite Rothschild, which is a wonderful Bordeaux. And 1982 was a particularly great vintage. And I drank that many, many years ago. And it was over the holidays, and it was with Chinese food. And it tasted great together. And so it was a little bit of a highbrow, lowbrow thing going on, but it worked. And I thought that was one of the best wines I've ever tasted. But that, I said my last glass of recreational, and I meant alcohol wine, because I have had wine since then. And that might surprise you, but not since I've told you there are alternatives. So maybe I did give away the punchline to begin with. And that is that there are wonderful non-alcoholic wines out there as well. So the last wine that I drank was this weekend, and it was a really delicious wine from Germany. And it was very high end, and it was absolutely fantastic. And it tastes different. It's not a 1982 Bordeaux, but it was still very good, and especially went well with food. So I had a great time drinking it. And so there are options, and there are wonderful options out there. If you are a person who enjoys wine, then certainly that is an alternative that you can use from time to time. But there are some fears out there, and that's why we have such a provocatively titled episode, The End of Wine. There are fears that wine is embattled. So basically, wine is in a place where it has been losing market share. So I believe that worldwide, wine is down 3% since last year, and it was already down. And so there is a fear among the wine world. These are people who work in wine, everyone from wine producers to wine writers, that maybe wine is going out of fashion. And maybe part of that has to do with alternatives and some of the health issues that are popping up around alcohol. So we're going to talk about all of that today. And we're going to start by talking about something that passed, but was a pretty good idea, but maybe a little defensive, called Come Over October. So if you haven't heard of this campaign, it was created by wine writer Karen McNeil, who wrote The Wine Bible. What a great book. I love that book. And Karen McNeil is an excellent writer. And Karen McNeil, along with some partners, came up with this idea called Come Over October. And the idea was that you would grab a bottle of wine and head over to a friend's house and drink it with them, right? Which is, again, that's a great idea. I love that. I think social wellness is so critical and important to our lives. Any opportunity that you have to spend with other people and enjoying a drink together, I think that's fantastic. Where I think that it ran into some challenges is that it was at the same time as Sober October, right? So this is a time of year when people are choosing to take a month off of alcohol to either reassess their relationship with it, maybe because they just want a break. Maybe they're in a little bit of a state where they're concerned about their drinking and they want to make sure that they have some space to really think about how they drink. And I think that that's a really good thing. So these are both competing good things, but one of them obviously seems like it was intended to maybe poke at the other one. And that led me to really think about the relationship of wine and kind of investigate a little bit more into the collective fears that we're hearing about wine. And so I wrote an article for my Substack. I have a Substack called Positive Damage. .substack.com. Highly recommend it. There's an article also by the same name called The End of Wine. And I got a lot of really great comments on it, a lot of really great questions coming out of it. But the main gist of it is that, yes, there is a concern with market share in wine. And not only is it down 3% worldwide, there's also retailers in the United States who are saying that the restocking, which means when they put the bottle back after it's sold, is down 6%. It's even more. And Karen McNeil and various other writers, she's not the only one, Dave McIntyre, who is a friend of mine, a wonderful wine writer with the Washington Post, started kind of expressing concerns about non-alcoholic months or these temporary abstinence challenges like Sober October. And the concern is that maybe that they're a little bit self-righteous, that they are imposing upon people who drink and saying you shouldn't drink. And that there is this sort of specter of neo-prohibitionism. So prohibition being the time and the period of time between 1919 and 1933 in the United States, where we were legally not allowed to transport or sell alcohol. You could technically drink it, but you could not buy it. And so that was where they got around that. And I have an episode that I would love for you to check out called Should Drinking Be Illegal? And I'll tell you in advance that anytime that you see a headline that has a question mark like that, usually the answer is no. So just to satisfy any fears, I am not a prohibitionist myself, but the wine writers we're starting, and some of the wine people are starting to get upset that potentially this neo-prohibitionism is rising. And it specifically addresses the World Health Organization, the WHO, and some of the studies and scientists who are pushing them, and the dietary guidelines that are set to be revised next year. That's another episode I recently put out, and I suggest you check out. And I did talk about this a little bit in it, but I'm trying to go into a little bit more detail. And so the WHO says no amount of alcohol is risk-free. And that, I think, is worrying people who have this idea or concept that wine especially is a cultural product, that it is something that can be beautiful and sublime, that it is communal, that it brings us together, like Come Over October. And that by taking that away, we're taking away something really important about who we are as a people. And obviously the WHO, that's not their principal concern per se. They're not really looking at it in terms of, is it good for culture or bad for culture per se. They're evaluating its risks, and those risks are being kind of juggled around a little bit. For instance, the United States, we have in our dietary guidelines, we suggest that somebody who's born male at birth can have 2 drinks per day. And somebody who is born female at birth can have 1 drink per day. In Canada, there are suggested guidelines that say 2 drinks per week for everybody. That's it. And George Koob from the NIAAA, which is the National Institute of Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse, essentially said that we might be moving towards the Canada model, which means that the United States, when we revise the guidelines, may be just 2 drinks a week. And of course, that to wine writers and to some of the wine world is they suggest that the science behind that is bad, that there's an ulterior motive, and that it's not good for our culture and community. I'm not going to get into every little detail of that because I don't think I can. I did in my article, I addressed some of the health concerns, and there are certainly the WHO is a very reputable organization. A lot of the studies that have come out, especially the ones that deal with all-cause mortality, have been very enlightening, right? Because in the past, they looked specifically at this disease, that injury, so forth, right? Overall, there's 200 diseases and injuries that are associated with alcohol. And so if you look at heart disease specifically, there are some mild protective factors from wine. Wine certainly can support that aspect of health to some degree. But what a lot of people like the WHO and people who are studying all-cause mortality are saying is it does not offset the problems with other diseases and injuries, especially cancer. So there are certain cancers that the risk starts at one glass. And that's where the problem comes in, right? So breast cancer would be an example of that. And so is that neo-prohibitionism? Another wine writer, Rod Phillips, who we're very lucky is going to be on our show, we can get into much more detail about this, has suggested the problem is really not the WHO and World Health Organizations and neo-temperance, but everyday changes that people are making in their lives. And some of those are health related. Some of those just happen to be that people are drinking different beverages, right? So instead of drinking wine, they're drinking cocktails or ready to drink RTD cocktails, or they've switched to non-alcoholic drinks. And so there are plenty of non-alcoholic drinks where people have switched to, myself included, that are really delicious and wonderful and actually still support the wine industry, by the way, because there are ones that are made by winemakers of grapes from wine regions. One of those, a friend of mine, Rachel Martin, who owns Oceana Wines, was the one who kind of pointed out to me that she thought Come Over October was being a bit defensive. She makes wines with alcohol and without alcohol, and suggested that instead, some of these wineries, if they found that they were not connecting to their audience, that they might suggest they might do some non-alcoholic or low alcohol wines, because low alcohol wines are also an option. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, and my name is Derek Brown, and we are talking about the end of wine, a very scary proposition to some people, but we're getting into non-alcoholic wines and low alcohol wines and how they could be a useful alternative for everybody, not just for people who are not drinking, but people in the wine industry too, because you can drink non-alcoholic wines alongside wines with alcohol. You could bring them over to your friend's house and you can all drink them together, which is kind of where I'm going with this, is that ultimately something like Come Over October, I think is a good sentiment, but does it mean that you can only bring wine with alcohol over, or can you bring non-alcoholic wines as well? That's where I would like to be. I would like to be in a point where we can drink both, where we can share both together, and we feel that we can get connection out of those, right? It also turns out that some of the purported health benefits of wine may be in non-alcoholic wines too. There's a lot more to study on that, but I find that very interesting because it could be that some things like resveratrol that have been purportedly a benefit within wine could be in non-alcoholic wines. These are antioxidants that help in terms of a protective factor for cardiovascular disease, for heart disease. And I love that because that means that you could get all of the benefits without the negative aspects of health aspects of alcohol. So let's talk a little bit about non-alcoholic wine, and then then I'll send you on your way. But for now, there are two major categories of non-alcoholic wine. One is grape-based ones. So they're actually based on grapes. They're grown like wine with alcohol. They share a lot of the characteristics, and then they're de-alcoholized. And the second group could be considered analog or proxies, and they're essentially wine. They're not wines at all, really. They sometimes made with grapes, sometimes made with cider, and sometimes made with other ingredients that kind of emulate the flavors of wine. And so they're designed to be consumed in the wine drinking occasion, which I think is really awesome. There's even tea-based wine-like products. Look, they taste like tea, but they're in a wine bottle. You pour them the same way. You pour them in a glass, you enjoy them with food. And so they are based on the wine occasion. And I think that this is where it all comes together. Ultimately, we should be able to drink together. I am not anti-wine. I love wine. In fact, that last glass I had of wine with alcohol is stuck with me. I still remember the whole profile. And I love especially traditional wines and wines that have a long heritage to them, and they've been grown in a specific region, and the terroir and the earth and the people that are part of those. I think that's really wonderful. But we have to acknowledge that there are people, and some of you may not be drinking wine, or maybe you're choosing to alternate. And so there has to be alternatives, and especially within the context of health concerns, because there are risks that some of us are willing to take and others are not. And some of us are already kind of pre-programmed with more risk than others, right? If we have a history of cancer in our family, or we have a history of cardiovascular disease, those things may affect the way that we want to drink alcohol. And some of us, because of alcohol use disorder or substance use disorder, which is more popularly called alcoholism, we can't drink at all, but we still may wish to enjoy a glass of wine, let's say a sparkling wine at New Year's, for instance. And so my contention is that this would be a wonderful way that we can all celebrate together. And let me be clear, even though wine has lost market share, it's actually increasing in sales. So the volume is dropping, the sales are increasing. And there are some reports that suggest that since 2007, that 35% of the public drinks wine. And that's remained fair. It's dipped a little bit, it's gone up a little bit, but it's remained fairly stable. So people aren't really ditching wine. So yes, it is not the end of wine. We have a long way to go. And it is a $400 billion industry. There's a lot of wine out there, and some of it is going to be dumped, and maybe it's going to go up and down a little bit. But realistically, it's not going to end anytime soon. And we're in a perfect moment where we can enjoy the best of both worlds, having a glass of wine and a glass of non-alcoholic wine together. Thank you so much for listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast. And we love to hear your comments, especially on this one. This one is one I think that a lot of people are concerned about. We'd love to hear what you think. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. We would love to hear from you. And as always, thank you for listening. And here's to drinking mindfully.